Um, I've been asked to give a bit of an overview of how the future will be for the energy storage or tank storage sector. As said, I work at the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies, which is a think tank, mainly for energy security, but also security in general. So we have conducted studies for FETSA as well as VOTOP. Let's just go back 1 year ago. And exactly May 2021, the International Energy Agency launched their roadmap towards net zero by 2050. It was one of the, if you like, thick PDFs you could download from the International Energy Agency website for free, which is quite okay because actually the World Energy Outlook you have to pay for. And this was a, if you like, front page news for a lot of papers, especially in the Western world. This particular report says that we can achieve net zero emissions by 2050, but that in the end of the day will be a very small and narrow path. But it will actually needs a complete transformation of the global energy system, and that will drive us, if you like, with large steps to a clean energy, innovative type of economy. And that means a rapid shift from fossil fuels, and you can see the dots and the points here. Electricity will become the core of the energy system, and especially the new low-emission industries will flourish. And actually, we will live then in 2050 in a clean energy world. A world where, I would say almost ironically, we all love each other. There will be greater international cooperation among countries. There will be close cooperation between businesses, investors, and citizens. And actually, the sun will be our best friend. This is what has been presented. In a way, I would say, keep on dreaming. This is what we call a backcasting scenario. We know what the end result should be, and that is only 1.5 degrees temperature rise by 2100. And the way to get there, we then model that back towards where we are living here and where we are living now. Well, then, of course, in October, November, there was COP26, so the International Climate Conference in Glasgow, and there a lot of, call them large consumers of energy got together and they came with their new pledges. And this is just an overview and you don't have to read it all, but it basically says that there was a lot of commitment from both China, currently being the largest emitter as far as CO2 is concerned, but also the USA and of course Europe with their Green Deal, but also India, and even Russia came sort of 1 week before the deadline with some sort of a plan towards, in their case, 2060 to eventually reduce CO2 emissions. There was a lot of good content in. This was not exactly according to the net zero path, but it was at least a pledge towards, if you like, a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature by 2100. But of course, this in the end of the day meant, or means, that energy policy is at the center to eventually moving towards 2050. And we all know the energy trilemma as far as energy policy is concerned. It needs to be a balance between sustainability, affordability, and security. And of course, the two slides I showed you before was very much, if you like, the center of gravity was towards sustainability. And we know that actually since 24th of February, the center of gravity is towards security, but also towards affordability. Already in December, we saw the gas prices, oil prices, but also CO2 prices going up very, very rapidly, which in the end of the day meant that a lot of governments actually had to interfere in order to eventually reduce that price, especially for those who cannot afford it. But then since, if you like, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, we came into a roller coaster modus. On the oil market, you see enormous high oil prices, a volatile market. As far as the global gas market is concerned, we saw prices spiking already in December, but also after the invasion. And then, of course, the whole global electricity market, one way or another, was volatile already, because all this new renewable energy had to, one way or another, if you like, has to be incorporated in this old system we know so well, which is very much dominated by fossil fuels. This is called, if you like, system integration. But the world Energy industry is about to be transformed. That's what we know. But we also know that energy insecurity will be with us and will be with us to stay for at least, if you like, the next decade. So if you then go back to what has been produced by the International Energy Agency in their World Energy Outlook, this is an interesting graph, and it's a bit complicated. I will not go through it in a lot of detail, but what you see here actually is oil and natural gas, and the amount of oil which is being produced in million barrels per day and in billion cubic meters. And here you see, if you like, the timeline towards 2050 and the various scenarios I just talked about. So the net zero scenario, the announced pledges scenario, and actually here it's called the stated policy scenario, actually where we are now, and if we just, if you like, transform that towards, calculate that through to 2050, we will be on that particular line. What if we do not invest in oil and gas anymore as far as supply? Then you see this, if you like, grayish or beige type of mountain. Actually, we will go down as far as production is concerned in a very fast modus. If you actually follow the net zero scenario, you probably will end up with around 30 million barrels of oil still to be produced by 2050, and hence still some, if you like, investment need to be done as far as existing production is concerned. If you take the announced pledges, there should be more investment as far as new fields, and there should be more investment as far as exploration and production is concerned altogether. The same actually applies for natural gas, similar sort of story. You see a dramatic different implications when you talk about investment. A strong policy push to reduce oil and gas demand is key to minimizing the risk of market tightening. That was at least the conclusion of the International Energy Agency. But then, of course, now, and here and now, we see all of a sudden a different type of sound. And that has to do, of course, again, with this invasion from Russia into Ukraine. We have this whole new plan of the European Union. It's actually a Green Deal plus. Maybe after 2030, because towards 2030, we have first to get rid of all the European energy, the Russian energy, and at the same time, yes, we then keep on coal-fired power stations a little bit longer on, but then eventually we go into a very rapid mode towards more, if you like, clean energy. So what you see is that the Repower EU plan wants to reduce the dependency on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of this year, and eventually, in the next years to be zero altogether. Now, focus here on gas, and I would say this is what I would call a recipe for a perfect and unavoidable storm. Because the Russian import, as you probably know by now, because it's repeated so often, is almost 31% of the actual supply coming from Russia is actually the supply we're using here in Europe. 150 BCM, more or less, sometimes a bit more, depends on how you define Europe in this particular case. This will be replaced as a whole, but it will be extremely difficult. And it will definitely create a boom for LNG producers elsewhere, for instance in the US, which is already happening, but also Qatar and other places. And look at this quote. This is not my quote. This is a quote from Rystad Energy, which I actually produce quite interesting studies. And here they actually say that this, for at least next winter, which is winter 22-23, there simply is not enough LNG around to meet demand. In the short term, this will make a very hard winter indeed in Europe. And the stage is set for a sustainable supply deficit, high prices, extreme volatility, bullish markets, and heightened LNG geopolitics. So far, if you like, the short term. And then going back to the World Energy Outlook of last November 2021, this is how Mr. Fatih Birol presented this particular graph. And this particular graph is about investment. It's about oil and natural gas production investment, and it's about clean energy and infrastructure investment. And here, again, you have 2018, and this is the net zero scenario towards 2030. And here he says, almost, in a very, he was very happy with that. He said, look, as far as oil and gas is concerned, we're exactly on target with respect to net zero scenarios. However, if you look here at investment with respect to clean energy and infrastructure, there is still quite a long way to go as far as investment is concerned, and this is in US dollars of 2020. Oil and gas investment is geared to a world of stagnant and falling demand, while transition-related spending is not rising nearly fast enough. But of course, you can look at this slide also from a different point of view, because actually you can say we are actually investing as far as oil and gas is concerned, because this particular report, which is from the International Energy Forum, which is, if you like, a cooperation of the International Energy Agency and OPEC, there actually they see that there is an investment crisis threatening as far as energy security is concerned. And they highlighted that here in this particular graph as far as upstream investment, oil and gas capex in this particular case, which obviously went down towards 2020 for all the good reasons, because that had everything to do with the demand plunge due to COVID. But you see that there has to be a lot of, if you like, makeup as far as investment is concerned towards 2025 and 2030, but this will probably be very difficult. And look at the reasons. Here you see these concerns and the lower future investment that can inflate prices. You see investment need to increase dramatically, as shown here. But the investment environment currently for oil and gas sector is becoming more and more challenging for also the reasons we are now getting familiar with. And that has to do with price volatility, that has to do with evolving government regulations, it has to do with increasing diverging long-term demand narratives, and of course also the ESG criteria, which are going to play more and more of a role in the investment world. So the new world in terms of supply, demand and pricing fundamentals, and this is actually a quote from a report from Deloitte in 2021, has to do with this supply deficit, has to do with supplier imbalance, with the ESG focus, if you like, and of course the decarbonization responsibility as far as large companies is concerned. We all know, of course, the trial which has been taking place here in the Netherlands towards Shell with respect to their Scope 1, 2 and Scope 3 obligations as far as the court rule is concerned, and surely that eventually will set, if you like, a precedent eventually for other companies, and especially Scope 3, which is in fact, of course, the consumer, if you like, as far as their emission is concerned, will be quite a challenge. So the transition will not be straightforward. And then if we go from investment to, if you like, trade volumes, this particular graph is an illustration of that. This is the value of the international energy related trade now and maybe towards 2050 if the net zero scenario becomes, if you like, a reality. This is the announced pledges scenario, where in terms of, if you like, of volume and especially in terms of value, it is more or less the same. However, if you look at the net zero scenario, you see, that there is quite a reduction. But look also at the shifts. Oil, still, if you look at the announced pledges scenario, very, very important in energy-related trade. If you look, however, at the net zero scenario, you see that especially critical minerals, which are so important for new energy technologies, are going to play a very, very important role, including, of course, the new molecules, which are clean then, if you like, the green hydrogen molecules. And then oil, natural gas and coal are going to play a much less important role as far as international trade is concerned. What will be, in the end of the day, become the reality? All in all, announced pledges, a growing share of oil and natural gas towards developing Asia, and we already see that now. Of course, the emerging economies, critical minerals and hydrogen-based fuels are on the rise in all scenarios, because also look here, hydrogen around 7% of the trade towards 2050 in the announced pledges. Well, to round off as far as energy security in transition is concerned, will it be an orderly or a disorderly transition? Because that, in the end of the day, is the question. Will there be more or less volatility in the future? I'm much more interested in not so much the end point or where we will be in 2030 or in 2050, but I'm much more interested in the road towards 2030 or the road towards 2050. What we will see that OPEC countries are going to balance the volatility in the market more than less. So we will be far more dependent on the Middle East towards 2030, 2040. The EU dependence on gas markets, I mean, is clear. But we eventually now, with Repower EU, would like to get rid of that, or at least rid of the Russian part of it. And it's still early days for hydrogen, or green ammonia, if you like, or whatever form of hydrogen we are thinking of, because those markets are not yet established. So there is still quite a vulnerability as far as disruption is concerned, or as far as establishing a market of supply and demand. And then, of course, the whole critical mineral market, and I'm not going to talk about that, but the dependencies on China are obvious if you talk about, for instance, rare earth, cobalt, or eventually lithium. So affordability, reliability, security of supply, and national security come into conflict, if it's real or perceived, with climate ambitions, and will these climate ambitions, as we see already now, in, if you like, the headline news, are they waning? All in all, we need to de-risk all these factors, especially market and policy tools eventually will help out. Well then, let's make the step towards the tank storage and the role of tank storage in the different value chains, but especially also in the energy transition. Well, this is probably very much familiar to you. The tank storage companies are essential players in the energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and food industries. And the fast storage capacity is a strategic asset for Europe, even now that the International Energy Agency is even releasing strategic stocks because of the high oil prices and the current crisis in Ukraine. Well, just to remind you how this role eventually in today's global supply chain is coming about. It's about domestic consumption. Here's an example of the Netherlands. Tank storage support countries economically, but also the geopolitical positions by fueling households, industries, strategic assets like ports, airports, and military assets. And like here in the Netherlands, we have the whole ARA cluster, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, but also Antwerp. And then, of course, another very important aspect is supporting the regional industry. So the close proximity of tank storage to industrial centers is enhancing the efficiency, but also the productivity. And then, of course, strategic storage, I already talked about that. In Europe, but also in other parts of the world, tank storage is an essential part of the emergency response to logistics and geopolitical disruptions. And we have an example now. But also military reserves support the European defense sector. And then as last, the international trade. Take the ARA ports, they account for almost, slightly less than 80% of all the liquid bulk throughout the region, especially here in this particular area. And the tank storage acts as a buffer in the market, contributing to price stability and reducing uncertainty. I'm sure these are all no-brainers to you in this particular case. But where will it actually go to? How will this particular sector reply on this rapidly changing world? This, if you like, changing global context. Well, the value chain of fuels and chemicals will be transformed, and no doubt about that, by especially the decarbonization policies, but the whole also drive towards global energy transitions. Emerging realities are accompanying innovations, and they will require the storage sector to constantly adapt. So in one way or another, every company should have a, if you like, a mid and a long-term plan to see whether they still remain profitable and whether they will have a long-term license to operate. Well, what we have done at HCSS, asked by VOTOP and VETSA, and VOTOP is the Dutch, if you like, branch organization for tank storage, for the tank storage sector, we have written 4 reports. And the first report very much, if you like, setting the scene as far as the global energy landscape is concerned. The second report was where do we stand? Where do we stand in Europe? you know, what is actually the business about. And then in the last two reports, and this one has just been issued, is about the midterm outlook towards 2030, 35, and this is the, if you like, the 2050 and beyond outlook, where eventually will the tank storage be positioned at that particular moment in time. So let me just give you a flavor in my last 3 slides on the midterm. I already illustrated where we are now, the midterm towards 2030. In the end of the day, for companies, it's all about proactivity, it's all about long-term planning, and in the end of the day, also transparency and working together. We will see, and that's in general, decarbonization policies will decrease the European consumption of fossil fuels. It's only very uncertain to what extent. The tank storage will have to balance the remaining demand for fossil fuels and the increasing demand for low carbon type of sources. So that's the next 10 years, that when we have this old system, which is dominant, the fossil system, next to a new upcoming system where the infrastructure actually still need to be built and understood. And of course, hydrogen is going to play an important role. The consumption and electrification in general are set in motion, but how far will they be in 2030? And will they have already a dominant role in the market midterm, 2030-35? Extremely difficult to predict. And then, of course, natural gas. Yes, import of natural gas will be becoming essential, given, of course, that pipeline gas from Russia is going to diminish very, very rapidly. Well, then if we look really further towards 2050, then of course you have to do that in a scenario modus. You cannot just, you know, think already of policies which eventually will be implemented, which is easier towards 2030. So we also looked at scenarios. We didn't invent new scenarios. There are already so many scenarios around, but we could not do otherwise than looking at scenarios. And therefore we also then identified potential pathways. Well, this dependence on the Middle East I already hinted on, and that will only become bigger and probably more pronounced. New energy hubs will emerge. Maybe not necessarily the energy hubs as we see them today. Maybe they will be in different parts of Europe. They will maybe be in different parts of the world. Most of the green hydrogen production will likely take place in countries where there is renewable energy power and can therefore be cheaply produced. So will that be Morocco? Will that be Namibia? Will that be Saudi Arabia? Renewable energy generation in Europe is dependent on critical minerals. And here again, we got this new dependency creeping in, and that is the dependency on China. So we know the dependency we have now, which is mainly Russia and the Middle East in the old fossil world, but in the new world with low carbon technologies, it will be mainly China. And then, and this is my last slide, this new geopolitical landscape. Because mind you, if you look at scenarios from various companies, including the International Energy Agency, very often they leave out geopolitics. Geopolitics is often not part of the game. Economic growth is part of the game, but not geopolitics. But we will definitely have a different geopolitical landscape by 2050. Power politics in countries with, for instance, critical minerals, and I already mentioned China, and low-cost hydrogen production facilities, they will emerge. That will be, if you like, the new oil or gas producing countries. The development of a new geopolitical landscape is, of course, extremely difficult to predict. But the speed and success of energy transition, therefore, relies, one, on policy choices, which we do together, international relations, technological breakthroughs, and infrastructure development. So, all in all, becoming part of the solution, and tank storage business should be part of the solution, will require collaboration and cooperation between storage companies to establish a unified position. And incremental change in both infrastructure and market development is required simultaneously in order to eventually move towards that new geopolitical or new, if you like, economic landscape. So I would like to end here. I have no idea how I did with time, as Rafi. Thank you very much.